Socialist does for us, we're likely to face quite naked fascism. So my feeling is, we got to stop fooling around. We've got to stop acting as if we have this infinite amount of time in order to get things right. We don't. We have very, very limited time. And I think we have to begin to start acting in accordance with that.
Okay. I think maybe the thing to do now is to take sort of 3 or 4 questions or comments to try and get as many sort of voices into this as possible. And then perhaps, depending on how things are going, we'll give Antoni a chance to respond if there's some direct questions there, or we'll just keep going. Sound good? Does anyone have a question?
So, like you're speaking more specifically with NDP, but you're saying that voting isn't the answer. But I guess my push would be in what are the more extreme situations where you just cited the recent provincial election in Ontario, where if the progressive voters didn't come out and vote for someone besides the PCs, the party would have got in, that their mandate was explicitly to remove a lot of the progressive mechanisms in the government, like for instance, cutting 100,000 mostly union jobs was one of the main electoral planks. So to me, like the recent Nova Scotia election, they all ran almost at the center, maybe classic neoliberalism, where the Tim Hudak was presenting the government to capital on a plate. So would you say even in situations like that, it would be better to not engage in the electoral process when you might have a government that would not be receptive to even more, a lot of non-electoral influence than by regular people?
Let's go to another question. We'll come back to it. Yeah.
What you say makes me think of something that I've thought of before in terms of positive power or negative power. Like if people have positive power, then they have power to enact specific changes, to get things done. Whereas if they have negative power, then they have power to prevent things from happening, but not to change the status quo. It's actually a bizarre source, but Douglas Adams wrote about this in Last Chance to See, about sort of species extinction. In talking about bureaucracies that he encountered in various post-colonial countries, and in that case, the people who were members of those bureaucracies, they could obstruct, they could not issue you that permit to go to this particular reserve. They had lots of obstructive power, but no constructive power. And it seems to me that that's tied up a lot in terms of whether voting is a useful strategy, what are the other strategies that we have. Maybe you can talk about that, Antoni, or maybe related to that, address, if we're talking about the alternative being creating social movements that would hold the NDP accountable, it seems to me that those would hold any party that's in power accountable, a particularly bad conservative government as well, for example. If you can talk about how that would be.
I guess the problem I see on all this, Antoni, is I think we're talking about some kind of assumption. The assumption is that somewhere unstated is an alternative to capitalism, but we don't articulate that, and certainly that is not articulated among the public as a whole. Among the public as a whole, the best we can hope for is some kind of benevolent adjustments to capitalism. And I think that if we emphasize too much the Armageddon, the end, that also plays into the capitalist coming up with a new technological fix that will fix that somehow. Well, it's not going to fix it. The technological fix is So how do we start to talk about a different kind of society that, you know, is going to express values of humanity, whatever you want to call it, and then we can talk about how we get there. I could go on, but that's the gist.
What, you go on, Harold?
But
Maybe one last question or comment for this round.
Yeah, I had a bunch of like, quick questions. I read the article with breakfast this morning. It was really good.
Breakfast was good.
Yeah, mostly coffee, but there was some sustenance in there too. One of the things that I'm really interested in is why people are politically apathetic in North America. I see that as a major problem. When I talk to people my age, I'm 25, and I talk to people my age, and they don't care about politics. They're not interested in it, and they don't see that as a way to adjust society. So I guess my question is, how can a radical political party or a radical politics gain traction within this framework or outside of it? And whether or not electoral politics is relevant to anti-capitalism, because like the way I see it, if you're anti-capitalist, this doesn't really fit with your, it's not going to fit with your politics, and it might also, I'm wondering if it's an explanation maybe for the precarious reluctance to vote or the reluctance to engage in politics more broadly.
Well, I find all four of these questions fit fairly well together, almost sort of in two breaks. So, Eva, what you were saying, I think, is largely what I would respond about the election in Ontario, which is that, well, we have to ask ourselves, why would we expect an administration that on the stump says, okay, you know, we're not going to do the nasty things that UDAC is going to do? Why do we think that they would be any different in office, or for that matter, why would he do what he says in office? Because often it's the case that politicians will, they'll make promises that go in the opposite direction. They talk about how, you know, they're going to completely gut the civil service or whatever the case may be, and then they come into office and actually they only, you know, cut through attrition or whatever because they don't dare actually eliminate all of the positions or whatever the case may be. So the point, as Eva said, is that if the people don't have power, it doesn't matter what the politicians say. They're going to do what they feel like, right? If the people do have power, again, it doesn't matter what the politicians say because they're going to do what we say, right? So the point is, well, I'm not keen on putting any sort of energy into elections at all, at least at the federal and provincial levels. I think there might possibly be something to be said about examining, say, municipal politics, because at least there aren't any parties involved there. But that being said, I think that there is something to be said for looking at particular circumstances. And one of the main arguments I've been leveling against the federal NDP is that they're simply immoral, and therefore we are immoral if we show them support in any way, including through the private act of casting a ballot for them, right? Even if nobody else knows, we're still betraying ourselves by doing that. Now, provincial NDP, the NDP, as you may know, is organized in such a way that there aren't, properly speaking, provincial NDP, New Democratic parties. Instead, they're just sort of branch plans of the federal party. So it's kind of ethically dubious to support a provincial NDP party, even a provincial New Democratic Party, even if they're not explicitly, say, signing off on the Five Eyes or whatever, because they're actually institutionally linked to the federal level. But that being said, it's not as clear. But I think a lot of it goes back to me to the question of where are you going to direct your efforts? As Eva was saying, well, even for the objective of making sure that, say these unionized positions aren't cut, Well, the way to do that is by mobilizing popular action against it. And if we can't do that, well, then why on earth, then whoever gets elected is going to do, they're going to cut the unionized jobs or whatever is going to please Bay Street, right? They're not going to, the politicians don't, it's not like, politicians get into office and then they say disinterestedly, what's in the best interests of the people as a whole? What is the national interest? Of course they don't. They do whatever capital expects them to do. And it won't matter who that is. And the only way we can counteract that is, as Eva said, is through popular action. Now, as for what forms this can take, well, there's a distinction, of course, between, I talked about the gas and water wars in Bolivia, and these were enormous uprisings involving scores of thousands of people setting up, blockades of burning tires and sometimes physically fighting with the police and so on and so forth. I mean, as I said before, it's not like, we can't just, put up a poster and say, oh, we need 20,000 people in Parade Square next week to oppose the loss of these unionized jobs. I fully recognize that. But how can we work towards that? What can we do in the meantime? To my mind, we are going to be more effective both in the immediate term and also in the sense of keeping ourselves whole, right? Not destroying ourselves as people through compromising, if what we do is undertake action directly to deal with people's condition. Like, again, we need to start asking ourselves, what are people's genuine needs, and how can we meet these? And now we come to what Errol was saying, which is that he was talking about the sort of lack of an alternative. Well, I can see why you would construe that as a problem, but I don't in the same way. I don't think that we can construct an alternative, an hegemonic alternative, at least at this stage. Right? As I was saying during my presentation, the institutional resources to us simply don't allow us to compete with the propaganda that's coming out of capital. Right? So we shouldn't try. Instead of coming up with clever marketing campaigns or having ideological blitzes or what have you. Again, what we can do is we can start to ask ourselves, well, what sort of action concretely should we be taking in the community? Whether it's obstructive resistance, like saying, darn it, we're not going to put up with these unionized jobs being struck, or whether it's constructive resistance, where we think about, like, how can we try to provide food for ourselves that as minimally as possible requires the circuits and the logic of capital. And in doing that, people will see what socialism is. It's not a matter of trying to teach them or persuade them. As I said, I don't think that would be effective anyway, but I don't think it has to be, because as I said, call me crazy, but I have faith in humanity. I actually think that most of us are sort of decent social beings, and that once you get capitalism's jackboot off our neck, and I think this isn't just my expression of faith. Historically, this is true, right? In the very few instances where capital or other forms of class-based society is forced to step back, and people are actually, ordinary people are actually allowed to organize their own lives, they treat each other a hell of a lot better than they do under capitalism, right? You see, like, for example, during a general strike, you see crime go way down. And, the cops aren't on the beat. Well, of course, that in itself accounts for the drop in crime, since the cops themselves are criminals. But, even aside from that, like, the sort of street criminals are actually less apt to victimize people at such times, right? So I think that's how we construct an alternative, is we don't talk about it. I mean, we talk about it within our own circles, and this is, I think it's important for socialists to have these discussions and for us to reorient ourselves. but I don't think that, Rosa Luxemburg once said there's nothing more ridiculous than going door to door preaching socialism. And I totally agree with her. I don't think that's a good idea. And now I've talked myself in circles, so I've sort of forgotten about the breakfast stuff. What was it?
Basically my question was is there any relevance, does electoral politics have any relevance to anti-capitalism? And does this maybe explain precarious workers' reluctance to engage in politics?
So so if I'm understanding you right, you're wondering if, well, it sounds like you're saying that you think that electoralism may actually be causing certain sectors of the population to sort of drop out politically. Is that right?
Yeah.
So are people familiar with this expression, the precariat? That's a lot of you people, by the way. It's like overeducated, underemployed people. You have educational attainments that are in excess of the kind of work that you're able to obtain. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the case. Towards socialism, I talk about two different types of right-wing parties that have become ascendant, particularly in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, including Canada to a certain extent. And one of them is it's trying to sort of repoliticize the precariat by being, coming across as sort of hip and progressive in some ways. For example, generally speaking, these parties will take a progressive position on queer rights, for example. But and also, they're usually very big on technology and stuff, and communications and all that sort of thing. But the trouble is that the way that they do it is not all that different from kind of old line far right parties like the ones that have come to the fore in the European Union recently. Those parties tend to be, what they look to is, say, unionized workers who've been laid off and are saying, like, what the hell? How come this new immigrant has been given my job, at half the rate or whatever, and they turn their anger on vulnerable groups like that. Well, then there are these other types of parties, like the most famous example is the Five-Star Movement under Beppe Grillo in Italy, which is, by the way, just after the European elections, Beppe Grillo formally allied his party with the fascists, which is, kind of proves what I've been saying about the Five-Star Movement. But they've been trying to bring back the precariat by saying, well, you know what, you folks, you went to college, you worked hard, you're smart kids, you don't deserve to be screwed around like this, and and it's actually those damn old unionized workers, they're the ones that are getting in your way, and we've got to kick them to the curb because they're obstructing everything. And so that there's a grave danger that electoral formations can arise. That the Green Party in Canada is, to some extent, it's not nearly as bad as the Five-Star Movement in Italy, but the Green Party in Canada is kind of a similar formation that tries to appeal to the precariat, and their slogan has become neither left nor right, but in front.
Another round of questions or comments?
This is not really a question, but more so if you could clarify. So assuming we've started mass movements and we've kind of kicked out this neoliberal cartel that we have in Canadian politics, assuming we've kind of ushered in sort of our own Bolivarian revolution, when you mean revolution, is that what you mean by it, or do you mean in more of because even in Venezuela, it's more of an ideology of reform away to socialism, or do you mean more so in a classical Marxist way where we storm the parliament and like that?
Well, yeah, I am making a distinction between, I probably should have been clearer on this in my presentation, between what is called the Bolivarian Revolution and what I mean by revolution. What I was saying was that I think that certainly the Bolivarian Revolution is a darn sight better than what we have here. And I think that quite possibly, I don't believe in socialism in one country. No wonder, I mean, it was basically a Stalinist notion. Marx certainly thought that it was, that it was impossible for socialism to flourish unless it became. And for me, that's what revolution is about: is a change in the entire world order, going from capitalism to socialism. But again, because by definition it's impossible for any one country to do that, and also it's sort of, that's an extraordinary moment that happens, and then you're on the other side of it. But what about when we're on this side, when we're still in capitalism? How do we live? This is where something like the Bolivarian Revolution comes for me as well. Sort of second best is we try to make such adjustments as we can within our day-to-day society, like that farmer weeding your ground, while we're waiting for the rain, which is the mass movements worldwide that would be necessary. And which, I mean, who knows? I mean, my guess is that we're all going to be dead in 50 years' time. I don't, to be honest, I think that's
You're on the positive side.
I think that's the most likely outcome. I'd say second most likely outcome is we're going to be living in some kind of nightmarish, world police state, where they're sort of like enclaves of the rich who have built domes over themselves to shield out some of the effects, and the rest of us peons are kind of their slaves. But I think there's a third possibility, and I don't know how likely it is, but I think, I do think it's possible, which is that before that happens, or while that stuff is in the process of happening, that people will recognize that we really do have nothing to lose but our chains, right? We'll be at a point where there's nowhere left to go, right? When this planet goes down, we go down with it. And so it's us or the capitalists, right? Again, I'm not saying how likely I think this is to happen, but I think it's a possibility. But in the meantime, until that day, I see something like the Bolivarian Revolution as something to aspire to, something to keep ourselves sane, something to improve our daily lives, something to keep us morally intact in the event that the circumstances do change such that there can be a true revolution, right? So we'll be the kind of people that can actually make use of a revolution instead of just creating the same old filthy business again over and over, as Marx put it. So yeah, Bolivarian Revolution and revolution, two separate things.
I'm not sure I understood. Did you say you didn't believe it's possible to have socialism in one country?
I did.
Okay. But you concede that it was possible for capitalism to exist in one country in the past?
Yes.
Okay, so why can't socialism do the same thing? Why can't it evolve the way capitalism evolved over 500 years to today? Why can't socialism do the same thing? That is, you have different nuances, different types, different varieties, if you will, depending on the internal conditions of their specific natures and the external factors fighting on them. Why couldn't that happen?
Well,
Theoretically.
I'd say that the main answer I give is contained in your question. We don't have 500 years. I doubt we have 50 years. If one, I agree with you that it does seem to me that you're probably right, that if we did have a more or less indefinite period of time ahead of us, one could well imagine the kind of gradual evolution that you're talking about. I'm not sure that I see any problem in principle with that idea. The trouble is that, again, I think in terms of plain fact, we don't have that amount of time. And so if one country, I'm not saying I'm against it, if somehow the conditions arose that it was a true revolution in some country and they attempted to institute socialism, I'm not saying like, you know, I'm not that type of Marxist that I'd say, oh, no, that's not the order that you go in. I don't mean that. But what I mean is, realistically, it seems to me obvious. When you look at, for example, how strong Washington's response has been, even to the Bolivarian Revolution, which has largely left the circuits of capital intact in Venezuela, right? And yet, you know, like they carried out a coup against Chavez. There was the strike of the National Oil Company. There's all this middle class rioting going on now that is being promoted by the Freedom House and other quasi-governmental institutions in the United States, as well as the CIA. They're pulling out all stops to do this, and that's not true socialism. So how much more so, I mean, for God's sake, if a country did? I mean, on the flip side, I guess if a country did institute or achieve real socialism, then that would probably, would tell us something about what the population is in that country is like and how politically evolved they are. And so maybe they would be able to successfully resist. So again, what I should say is, you're probably right that there's no theoretical barrier to that happening, but I just think that pragmatically that strikes me as even, oddly enough, less likely than worldwide revolution.
Should probably move towards wrapping up in a few minutes so we can catch the rest of the third place World Cup game, which I know is hot on all our minds. Maybe Brazil and Netherlands.
Nobody cares what third place is.
It's on somebody's mind.
It's on somebody's mind. So maybe we'll take one last round of questions. I wanted to ask one, because I get to. Another one, I guess, which is, I guess, about a vehicle. So I think a lot of people see the NDP as, you know, for all of its failings, a vehicle by which to amalgamate the efforts and the intentions of a great many people towards certain projects. And the hope, I think, among many sort of people on the left of the NDP is that, yes, you know, every 4 years we have to support the NDP when they run for government, but this will become an organizing means for the left. And, you know, along with the unions, it's going to become a means of political change. Now, I think it's pretty clear you don't agree with that, and you explained to us why, but then what is the alternative to that? Is it to resume cadre-based organizing, to come back into small or larger groups that would have specific internal debates and intentions and go out and organize people? Is it a more, let's say, anarchistic mode where it's based on smaller affinity groups working in different communities? Is it something more like some of the recent sort of socialist efforts we've seen that don't attempt to become an electoral party, but seek to create a broad membership-based group that is going to organize towards specific goals? What do you see as the sort of the vehicle to bring about the sorts of radical transformations in conscious and reality that need to happen in order to actually build this grassroots revolution? That'd be my question, but maybe we'll get a couple other ones before we go to that. Oh,
I just want to comment on the Bolivarian Revolution, or whatever. Yeah, it's true, the capitalists still are there, and they're still very powerful. But what has happened in Bolivia is that through the activities of the government, they have created for the people an alternative vision to the powers that be, through various things, education, health programs, collective farming programs, all kinds of programs. And that has resulted in a long string of electoral victories for the government. When I talk about alternatives, I'm not talking about some Soviet state or some, Soviet democratic state, but I am talking about people thinking about alternative ways of living as opposed to under capitalism. and alternative ways of thinking as opposed to under capitalism. And if we don't do that, it doesn't matter what states we have, it doesn't matter what political structures we have, nothing will change anyway.
Here?
I wanted to say, Antoni, I really enjoyed your talk today, and in addition to your writings online, leading up to it. What I'm going to say is a bit tangential to a lot of what you presented, but I just feel the need to throw out that, particularly with the discussion around elections, the right to vote, the importance to voting, those types of conversations, particularly when we talk about like marginalized communities and, you know, if we get like the poor or, you know, people in particular communities to vote the power or whatever. I'd like to point out that particularly Canada being a settler state, as that actually the right to vote and elections, particularly as we talk about First Nations people, it's actually been used as a weapon against First Nations people. If you get First Nations people to vote in a Canadian election, it doesn't matter, we're not talking about whether it's NDP or not, just voting period, is a disenfranchisement process that that not only violates the spirit and nature of the treaties, but is used to legally disenfranchise Aboriginal peoples as being their own sovereign entities, and has been part and parcel of Canada's assault on First Peoples here by assimilating them into the Canadian body politic, and thereby, so I guess more of a comment, but we're not talking about, you know, elections and the Canadian left. We're talking about, you know, federal elections and Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And I find that an interesting irony sometimes when people talk about the importance of First Nations voting. It's like, but actually, that's actually an assault on them. Their participation in that is an assault on, you know, them having the right and the ability to recognize their ways of life and their ways of being and their ways of political organization on these lands. Just felt we need to throw that out there. It's tangential too, but we're also on this land.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. And my question is really to Max's question before. So I'm wondering if there's any point really in being part of these radical leftist groups, especially in Toronto, where I'm from. So I'm part of the Young Communist League, and we actually, there's a lot of struggle because there's a lot of assumptions about the party, and also like what the party's past. So a lot of people are like scared of the Young Communist League. I think that we are too sectarian, that we engage in these debates with like the Maoists and these like other groups, and there's no point of even like starting the chapter here, for example, because it's just gonna like further divide left. So I'm both like part of that party, but then also these groups that are more like community based, that organize around certain issues. Though I like the former, I do like being part of the YCL because I could just be out there about my politics, and we have like a pretty like clear and consolidated vision in that sense. But we're all like also open to other people's campaigns and like other ideas about socialism. It's just a lot of work in organizing and, you know, trying to like recruit people and do all these things. So do you think there's a point in being a member of these radical leftist groups?
Maybe if anyone has any last minute questions, and then we'll give it back to Antoni and we'll wrap it up.
Well, I see actually Pierre's comment, and I don't know your name, I'm sorry, your question is as being connected to the, well, one thing that I read about representational democracy is that it's defined by who's an electorate. But once you define, you know, who is included, who has the right to vote, then you're also defining who's excluded. And I'd be interested in talking more about that afterwards. I think it's maybe a little bit more tangential, but we don't have time for it right now.
Any last? All right, we'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thanks for your comment there. And as for these other three questions, I think they all seem to center on matters of organization, what constitutes an alternative. What I would tend to suggest is that, well, Errol, you said that the government did these great things, and that's why they came up with these ideas, and that's why people voted for them. And I don't know if this was your intention, but the way you made it sound was as if the government were these heroes who had come up with all sorts of great ideas, and the people said, great. What I would say is that, again, I think those ideas are imminent in us. I don't think that most of us need to be told by any higher power that it's good to embody progressive values or whatever. I think that's the natural way we would live when we're not being restrained by outside authority. And so, again, I don't think there's any sort of need for a sort of advanced part of the population, still less a structurally elevated part of the population, such as politicians, to tell people about how great socialism is, or whatever, or what other ways there are of being in the world. Although I would say I appreciate your way of defining socialism as a way of being in the world, because I think far too often people misunderstand it as simply a way of organizing an economy, which if it were only that, it would be trivial. It's far, far more important than that, and far more wide-reaching. But I think what needs to happen, for the most part, at least at this stage, is that we need to instantiate those values in practice, right, through our actions. And I think, for me, that would certainly come first. So if the Young Communist League, say, allows you to do that, it provides a forum for that to happen, then yay, the Young Communist League. If your community groups allow you to do that, but again, in a principled fashion, because what I want to make clear is I don't think it's, I'm not recommending that we just do nice things. Like, I talked about a community garden before, and I should say a little more about that. What I'm talking about, community gardens are always great. Jocelyn will tell you. But I don't think that in itself is the kind of political action that I'm talking about. What I think is necessary is that people think about the way of being in the world, as Errol put it, and about how a community garden can be an instantiation of that. So, yes, I mean, it's nice that people grow their own vegetables and they hang out together and blah, blah, blah. But we need to think about more than that. We need to think about, as Pierre and Max have said, that we're on unceded tribal land. And we need to think about the fact that the Mi'kmaq didn't recognize this idea of property ownership, right? It was nonsensical to them. You use the land in a respectful way. You don't possess it. So we need to think about that. If we want to set up community gardens, we've got to keep that in mind, and we need to give the finger to the notion that there's any such thing as property ownership, including so-called crown land, right? And so I think that, to me, is the key to providing an alternative. Is thinking about ways that you can act in a principled manner. And I guess it's not given in advance what forum will be appropriate to that. I do tend to be, but I think that certainly the idea of putting organization first, as if a certain organizational model, be it a party or whatever, is what we should think about. And we'll get that up and running, and then we'll figure out what we want to do. No, I think that's kind of backwards. I think we need to think about what sorts of actions we need to carry out, and then once we start doing that, we can kind of look around and see, well, what is the best way to organize this. But I think the activity should come first. The activity, and again, the principles, because I think that the activity, if it isn't principled, is futile. It's not good. I mean, I shouldn't say it's futile. I mean, again, a community garden is a good thing, regardless of why you're doing it. But compared to the fact that the ice caps are melting, I don't think it's all that significant.
Great. Well, just before we wrap up, I would remind you that at the end of the month, on July 30th, Radical Imagination and the Social Forum Organizing Group here in town are putting on an event at the Company House at 7 o'clock. A fundraiser, should be fantastic. We have some great speakers lined up. There'll be some entertainment. It'll be like here with great ideas, except there'll be a bar, so it'll be better. Not that, you know. So that'll be
Soccer game on TV?
Soccer will be over by then.
Oh,
Yeah, and then I'd also, the Radical Imagination Project also this September is organizing a festival, a 2-day festival of speakers and exciting events and book launches, including our own book launch. So that should be very exciting, so keep your eyes peeled for that. You can find out more at radicalimagination.org. NSPIRG, the Nova Scotia Public Interest Research Group, also put this event on. So I'd like to thank them, I'd like to thank Antoni, and I'd especially like to thank all of you for having such a convivial and stimulating discussion today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next.
And I likewise would, of course, like to thank you all for your participation, as well as Max. And well, Alice Snavage couldn't be here because his kid is being born or something, I think.
Celebrating.
Having a birthday. But those two guys are the principals of Radical Imagination. And thanks also to Jordan Roberts and NSPIRG. And Emily, do you
Yes.
have one else? You have that? Oh, Eva does, yeah. And also
Oh, yes.
the Worst of Times Collective, where well, maybe you want to talk about it yourself.
Yes, if you'd like a paper copy, a nicely formatted paper copy of Antoni's essay, you can purchase one from Brad.
Except that Brad isn't here.
Except that Brad isn't here. I was supposed to bring one, just bring them, but I sadly forgot. So if you would like to purchase one, come talk to me and I'll make sure you're connected. You have an announcement?
Yeah, if that's all right. I just wanted
Yes.
to make sure everyone knew that you mentioned fracking during your speech.
Oh, yeah.
And July 23rd is the Halifax fracking meeting. There's a provincial review of whether the moratorium will be lifted in Nova Scotia or not, and there's going to be 10 meetings around the province. July 23rd from 6 till 8. They'll be held here in King's Alumni Hall. And we do need like 300 people is how much that room holds, and we'd like at least 300 people to show up. If you want to talk more about it, feel free to come and chat with me after. We've put a toolkit together. Part 1 and Part 2 is coming.